I was holding a pen hovering over a wire transfer authorization for $700,000 to pay for my daughter's dream wedding at a chateau in Paris. I had worked my entire life to be able to give her the world. But then an email popped up on my screen. It was from her. She wrote that the Duponts were Parisian aristocracy, and my gruff American manners and inability to speak French would humiliate her in front of her new in-laws. She explicitly banned me from attending the wedding, but reminded me that the wire transfer needed to clear by 9 in the morning. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply put the pen down, and I made a decision that would change her life forever. The next morning, I woke up to 68 missed calls. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who took your sacrifices for granted. My name is James Gallagher. I am 66 years old, and I own a logistics and freight company in Chicago. I built it from a single rusted delivery truck into a fleet that covers the entire Midwest. My office sits right above the main warehouse floor. I like it that way. I like the smell of diesel fuel and the low, constant rumble of the engines. It reminds me of what is real. It reminds me of the sweat and the grinding hours that bought the suit I wear and the leather chair I sit in. On that particular Thursday evening, the warehouse below was quiet. The second shift had just clocked out, and the silence in my office was heavy. On my mahogany desk sat a single piece of crisp white paper. It was a bank authorization form, $700,000. That was the final balance required by the wedding planners in Paris to secure the Chateau de Versailles for my daughter Natalie's wedding reception. It was an absurd amount of money. It was more money than my late wife Diane and I made in our first 10 years of marriage combined. But Natalie was my only child. When Diane passed away 15 years ago from breast cancer, I made a silent vow at her hospital bed that I would never let our daughter go without. I wanted her to have the fairy tale we never got to experience. I picked up my favorite gold pen. I adjusted my reading glasses. I felt a swell of quiet pride. A kid from the south side of Chicago, who used to load crates until his fingers bled, was about to rent out a French palace for his little girl. I pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line. Then my computer chimed. It was the sharp metallic ping of a high-priority email arriving in my private inbox. I glanced at the screen. The sender was Natalie. The subject line read, "Urgent regarding the wedding protocol." I set the pen down on the desk, rubbed my tired eyes, and clicked open the message. I expected a frantic question about flower arrangements or seating charts. Instead, the words on the screen hit me with the force of a physical blow. "Dad," she wrote, "I need to be completely honest with you about the wedding next month. Antoine's family, the Duponts, belong to a very different world than the one you are used to. Genevieve, Antoine's mother, has very strict standards for social etiquette. I have been thinking about this for weeks, and I have made a very difficult decision. Your gruff American manners, your loud voice, and your complete inability to speak French will humiliate me in front of my new family. I have spent years trying to fit into high society, and your presence will ruin the image I have carefully constructed. You will embarrass me. I am asking you not to book your flight. It is better for everyone if you stay in Chicago. However, the venue contract still requires the final escrow clearance. Please ensure the $700,000 wire transfer clears your bank by 9 in the morning tomorrow. Genevieve is handling the vendors, and any delay will be catastrophic. Do not call me right now. I am too stressed to argue." I read the email again, and then a third time. I waited for the anger to come, for the urge to pick up the phone and scream at her. But the anger did not come. Instead, a cold, suffocating silence wrapped around my chest. I looked down at my hands resting on the edge of the mahogany desk. They were the hands of an old man now, but the scars and thick calluses from my 20s were still there. I remembered the winter of 1982. I remembered working double shifts on the loading docks in sub-zero temperatures, my boots soaking wet, my back screaming in agony just so I could pay the tuition, for the elite private boarding school Natalie had begged to attend. I remembered eating cold sandwiches in the cab of my truck, so I could afford the riding lessons, the designer clothes, and the European summer trips she insisted she needed to fit in with the wealthy kids. Diane had warned me. My beautiful, wise Diane had sat at our kitchen table years ago watching me write another massive check for Natalie's expenses. "James," she had said softly, "you cannot buy her a soul. If you give her everything without making her earn it, you will leave her with no moral compass. You will raise a stranger." I had brushed off Diane's worries back then. I thought I was just being a good provider. I thought I was protecting my daughter from the harshness of the world. But looking at that email, I realized Diane had been absolutely right. I had raised a stranger. I had financed the creation of an arrogant, entitled woman who viewed her own father not as a human being, but as an embarrassing ATM machine. She was literally banning me from the most important day of her life, while simultaneously demanding a small fortune to pay for a party designed to impress people who looked down on the very labor that funded their champagne. The silence in my office deepened. I looked back at the wire authorization form sitting on my desk. The signature line was completely blank. I picked up the piece of paper. I did not crumple it. I did not throw it across the room. I held it gently, walked across the thick carpet of my office, and stood in front of the industrial paper shredder. I turned the machine on. The mechanical hum filled the room. I fed the $700,000 authorization into the metal teeth. I watched the crisp white paper disappear, listening to the satisfying sound of it being sliced into thousands of meaningless ribbons. Then I walked back to my desk and picked up my cell phone. I dialed the direct emergency line for my corporate banker. It rang twice before he picked up. "Arthur." I said, my voice steady and cold. "I need you to cancel the pending wire transfer to the Chateau de Versailles. I also need you to completely freeze the international escrow account tied to the wedding trust. Yes, immediately. Put a hard stop on all outgoing funds." I hung up the phone. I sat back in my leather chair and opened my laptop. I logged into the escrow portal and watched the screen refresh. A red notification banner popped up instantly. Account frozen. 5 minutes later, an automated alert arrived from the French venue management system. The payment deadline had been missed. The contract was officially in default. I closed the laptop. The transaction was dead. The money was safe. And the wedding, as far as I was concerned, was no longer my problem. I turned off the lights in my office, walked down the metal stairs to the empty warehouse floor, and headed out into the cold Chicago night. The storm was coming, but for the first time in 15 years, I was not going to be the one to shelter Natalie from the rain. 12 hours later, the sun had not yet risen over Chicago. I have always been an early riser. It is a habit left over from the days when I had to be at the loading docks before the first delivery trucks arrived. My body clock does not care about millions in the bank or leather desk chairs. At 4:30 in the morning, my eyes open and the day begins. I walked into my quiet, dark kitchen. The hardwood floors were cold under my bare feet. I did not turn on the main lights. I liked the quiet. I liked the stillness of the house before the city woke up. I went through the familiar motions of making my coffee, ground the beans, boiled the water, poured it slowly into the French press. The rich, dark smell filled the room, grounding me, reminding me of the simple things that money could never actually improve. I carried my black coffee to the large window overlooking the street. I watched the snow gently falling, covering the pavement in a thin, pristine layer of white. I took a slow sip. It was hot and bitter, exactly the way I like it. For a long time, I just stood there. I did not feel regret. I did not feel the sudden urge to undo what I had done the night before. I only felt a strange, hollow calmness. I had finally stopped pretending. I had finally stopped trying to buy a relationship that did not exist. My personal cell phone was sitting face down on the kitchen island. I had turned it off completely the moment I walked out of my warehouse the previous evening. I knew what was coming. I just wanted one final, peaceful night of sleep before the storm hit. I finished the last drop of my coffee, set the empty mug down on the granite counter, and walked over to pick up the phone. I held the power button. The screen illuminated the dark kitchen with a harsh, bright glow. It took a few seconds to connect to the network. Then the device practically vibrated out of my hand. The alert chimes came in a rapid, overlapping flood of sound. Ping after ping after ping echoing off the kitchen walls. The screen filled with a cascading waterfall of notifications lighting up my face in the dim room. I stared at the numbers on the screen. 68 missed calls. I slowly scrolled through the log. 42 missed calls were from Natalie. The first one had come in at exactly 2 a.m. Chicago time. That would have been 9 a.m. in Paris. The exact moment the French bank opened its doors and the wedding venue realized the escrow account was empty. The exact moment the carefully constructed facade began to crack. After the first dozen calls, her frequency had increased to 1 every 3 minutes. Panic had clearly set in. There were also 15 missed calls from an international number. I recognized the country code for France. That was undoubtedly the luxury wedding planner, a woman who charged an exorbitant fee to curate perfection, now desperately wondering why her most lucrative client was suddenly defaulting on a massive payment. And then there were 11 missed calls from Antoine, my future son-in-law, the aristocratic Parisian who was supposedly too refined for my gruff American manners. I did not listen to Natalie's voicemails. I knew exactly what they would sound like. They would start with demanding arrogance, shift into hysterical confusion, and finally devolve into desperate, manipulative pleading. I had heard it all before whenever she overdrew her accounts or crashed an expensive car. I was immune to her tears. They were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of inconvenience. But Antoine's missed calls caught my attention. Why was Antoine calling me directly? Natalie had always strictly managed all communication between us. She claimed it was because of the language barrier, insisting Antoine spoke very little English and that she needed to translate everything to avoid cultural misunderstandings. Curiosity got the better of me. I tapped the voicemail icon and clicked on the most recent message from Antoine. I raised the phone to my ear, expecting to hear frantic, heavily accented French, or perhaps Natalie crying in the background. Instead, I heard a man breathing heavily, followed by a voice speaking in perfect, unaccented, desperate English. "Mr. Gallagher." The voice on the recording was sharp and clipped. "This is Antoine. I expect you to receive this message and act upon it immediately." I pulled the phone away from my ear for a fraction of a second, staring at the screen just to make sure I had clicked the right audio file. I had. I pressed the speaker back to my ear. Antoine was not speaking French. He was not struggling with a thick accent. His English was flawless, polished with the kind of expensive private school diction that costs more than my first warehouse. For 2 years, my daughter had insisted her fiancé could barely string a sentence together in my native language. She had orchestrated every dinner, every holiday visit, every brief telephone greeting, translating for us, acting as the necessary bridge between 2 completely different worlds. It was all a lie. A calculated, deliberate barrier to ensure I never had a real conversation with the man she was going to marry. I stood completely still in my kitchen, watching the snow fall outside the window, listening to the arrogant tone of the man on the recording. "We have a severe crisis this morning," Antoine continued, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "The manager at the chateau just informed my mother that the wire transfer was rejected. I then contacted the holding bank for the Gallagher Family Trust, and they told me the escrow account is frozen. Natalie is in the other room having a complete meltdown, and my parents are deeply offended by this humiliation." I listened to him breathe heavily into the receiver. He was not calling out of concern for his bride. He was calling because the money had stopped flowing. "I do not care what kind of petty dispute you are having with your daughter," Antoine said, his tone dripping with absolute disdain. Natalie assured my family that her trust fund was completely autonomous. She promised my mother that her inheritance was liquid and ready to cover the entire cost of the venue. "You are merely the executor of her grandfather's estate, and you have no right to withhold her money out of some pathetic Midwestern spite." I stopped breathing. The cold air radiating off the kitchen window seemed to seep directly into my bones. Her trust fund, her inheritance, the executor of her grandfather's estate. Natalie had not just hidden me because I wore work boots and possessed calloused hands. She had completely erased me from my own life story. She had told the DuPont family that the millions of dollars in my bank accounts belonged to her. She had likely told them I was some disgraced estranged relative, or worse, just a hired manager overseeing wealth she had inherited from someone else. She portrayed herself as an independent American heiress, completely severing the reality that every single dollar she spent came directly from the sweat on my brow. "You will fix this clerical error immediately," Antoine demanded, his voice growing louder and more frantic. "My family vineyards are currently undergoing restructuring, and we cannot afford to cover this unexpected default. Natalie money was supposed to guarantee the Versailles reservation. If those funds are not released by noon, my mother will cancel the engagement. Do your job, Mr. Gallagher. Release her money." The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I lowered the phone. The quiet of the kitchen returned, but it felt entirely different now. The betrayal was no longer just an insulting email about my lack of French etiquette. It was a massive structural deception. She had sold a fantasy to a family of desperate, impoverished aristocrats. Antoine had just revealed that his own family was drowning in debt. The DuPonts were broke. Their famous vineyards were undergoing restructuring, which is just a polite corporate term for bankruptcy. They were marrying Natalie for her money. For my money. They thought they were securing a wealthy American heiress to save their sinking ship. And Natalie thought she was buying a prestigious European title with a blank check signed by the father she was too ashamed to invite to the ceremony. It was a mutual grift, a house of cards built on top of my life work. I set the phone down on the granite counter. I did not feel a trace of sorrow. I did not feel the sting of a broken heart. The daughter I had loved, the girl I had worked double shifts to protect, did not exist. She was a ghost. In her place was a cynical stranger who had tried to play me for a fool. I looked at the clock on the stove. It was 5 a.m. The business day was about to begin. I needed to make a call. I needed to speak to a man who understood how to dismantle a life with surgical precision. I stood by the granite kitchen island, letting the heavy silence of the house settle around me. The scattered pieces of a massive, ugly puzzle were finally snapping together. For 2 long years, my daughter had kept me entirely separated from her new life. She had told me the DuPonts were intimidatingly formal, claiming they would harshly judge my working-class background. She made me feel like an embarrassing secret that needed to be hidden away in Chicago. But the truth was far more sinister than simple snobbery. I was not just an embarrassment to her. I was a direct threat to her fictional narrative. She had completely rewritten our family history. She cast me as a deadbeat, a glorified accountant, merely managing a trust fund that rightfully belonged to her. I thought back to the few brief video calls we had shared with Antoine and his parents. Natalie was always quick to mute the microphone. She was always eager to end the conversation early. She claimed it was a poor internet connection or a busy social schedule. Now I knew the reality. She was absolutely terrified I would mention my logistics company. She was terrified I would speak about the warehouse, the freight trucks, or the grueling decades I spent building the exact wealth she paraded around Paris as old family money. She had sold them the dazzling illusion of an independent heiress, a cosmopolitan socialite who had inherited a vast, untouchable fortune. And the DuPont family bought it completely. They swallowed the lie because they were desperate for a financial savior. They were drowning in debt, actively searching for a wealthy American to bail out their failing legacy. Natalie played the perfect mark, using my life savings as her counterfeit credentials. It was a spectacular collision of greed and delusion. A profound, irreversible shift occurred inside my chest. The last lingering shred of parental guilt evaporated into the cold morning air. Any fatherly urge to protect my little girl vanished entirely. It was replaced by a crystalline, absolute clarity. I had spent decades carrying the weight of her world on my weary shoulders. I had silently absorbed her insults, paid her exorbitant debts, and ignored her casual cruelty because I made a deathbed promise to my late wife. I truly believed unconditional love meant unconditional financial support. I was completely wrong. Unconditional support had only bred a monster. Natalie did not view me as a father. She viewed me as a host organism. I was nothing but a resource to be drained dry and then discarded the very moment she secured her fraudulent aristocratic title. Well, the host was finally fighting back. The money supply was permanently severed, and her Parisian illusion was about to shatter into a million pieces. I walked away from the kitchen window. The time for silent mourning was officially over. It was time to go to war. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I rarely used before 6 in the morning. Warren Cole was not just my corporate attorney. He was a pit bull in a custom-tailored suit. We had known each other for 30 years. He had helped me navigate the ruthless freight contracts in the early days of my business, and he knew exactly how much blood and sweat I had spilled to build my empire. Warren was a man who understood the value of loyalty, and he despised entitlement more than anyone else I knew. When he answered the phone, he did not sound groggy or surprised. He simply stated my name, his voice sharp and alert, waiting for me to explain the problem. I told him I needed to execute a complete and immediate financial severance. I did not want to leave a single cent available for her to access. I told him to pull up Natalie's entire financial portfolio: the corporate black cards, the emergency travel funds, the offshore trust access, the luxury concierge services. Warren did not ask for an emotional explanation. He did not offer any useless sympathy. He simply asked for the verbal authorization codes required to bypass the standard banking delays. I gave them to him without a shred of hesitation. I could hear the rapid, heavy clicking of his keyboard through the speaker. He was a master at his craft, tearing down a financial fortress with absolute precision. "The primary platinum card is officially canceled," Warren said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "The emergency international travel line of credit is permanently closed. The secondary accounts tied to your holding company are frozen, and her access to the corporate jet charter account has been completely revoked." I listened to the sound of those final clicks. Each one was a massive steel door slamming shut on the lavish life my daughter had taken for granted. For her entire adult life, she had swiped a piece of plastic without ever looking at the price tag. She bought designer handbags that cost more than my warehouse foreman made in 6 months. She treated luxury as her birthright, assuming the well would simply never run dry. Now she was going to have to figure out how to buy a simple cup of coffee with her own money, if she even had any money of her own. I knew she did not. Warren paused his typing for a moment. He finally asked me what had triggered this sudden financial execution. I told him about the email. I told him about Antoine's furious voicemail and the arrogant demands for the trust fund release. I told him how my own daughter had rewritten my existence to impress a family of supposedly wealthy Parisian aristocrats, erasing my hard work and pretending my money was old family wealth. Warren went completely silent. I could practically hear the gears turning in his sharp, calculating mind. He asked me to spell the DuPont family name and to give him the specific region in France where their ancestral estate was located. I paced the length of my kitchen while Warren worked his magic. He had extensive connections in international banking and offshore asset management. He knew exactly how to dig through the manicured, perfumed layers of generational wealth to find the inevitable rot hiding underneath. 10 long minutes passed. The sun was finally starting to break over the Chicago skyline, casting a pale, cold light across the granite countertops of my kitchen. Then Warren let out a low, humorless laugh that sent a chill down my spine. James Warren said, his voice laced with a dangerous kind of amusement. "Your daughter is not marrying into high society. She is marrying into a sinking ship." He began to meticulously list the financial realities of the DuPont family. They were not just facing a temporary cash flow problem or a minor banking error. They were swimming in decades of accumulated crippling debt. Their historic vineyards had failed to produce a profitable yield in over 5 years due to severe mismanagement. They had leveraged their ancestral chateau to the absolute brink, taking out loans to pay off other loans. They were currently facing foreclosure from 3 different international banks, and the French government was preparing to seize their assets for millions in unpaid taxes. The realization hit me like a freight train. Antoine had not proposed to Natalie out of blind romance or passionate love. He had financially targeted her. The DuPonts had actively hunted for a naive, wealthy American to bail out their disgraced, crumbling legacy. They needed an immediate, massive influx of liquid cash just to stop the banks from padlocking their estate. Natalie, desperate for an aristocratic title and desperate to distance herself from my blue-collar Chicago roots, had offered them the absolute perfect lifeline. She had flaunted my bank accounts as if they were her own personal piggy bank, and the DuPonts had swallowed the bait completely. It was a spectacular collision of massive egos and absolutely zero substance. They were grifters attempting to con a grifter. The irony was so profound, it almost knocked the breath right out of my lungs. Natalie had traded a father who would have moved mountains for her for a family of desperate aristocrats who only saw her as a walking bailout check. She had sacrificed the only genuine love she had ever known for a group of people who were quite literally planning to drain her dry. "Let them burn," I told Warren, my voice echoing with a finality that surprised even me. "Let the international banks take their precious vineyard. Let the tax collectors seize their historic paintings. And let my arrogant daughter figure out exactly how to survive in Paris with a bounced check and a canceled platinum card." I hung up the phone. The house was completely silent again. The shock had faded, replaced entirely by a cold, hardened resolve. The war had officially started, and I held every single weapon. The warehouse floor was a symphony of organized chaos. I stood by the reinforced glass window of my office, looking down at the fleet of forklifts moving heavy pallets. The smell of exhaust and cold concrete was a comfort. It was 9 a.m. and the business was running at full capacity. I had spent the last 3 hours reviewing shipping manifests, completely ignoring the silent personal cell phone locked away in my desk drawer. I knew the storm was raging across the Atlantic, but inside my 4 walls, everything was strictly business. Then the heavy metal door to my office swung open. It was Mike, my head dispatcher. He is a massive guy, a former Marine who has worked for me for 20 years. Nothing shakes Mike. He handles blizzard delays and blown engines without blinking an eye. But right now he looked profoundly uncomfortable. He stood in the doorway holding a cordless dispatch phone like it was a live grenade. He cleared his throat and told me that my daughter was on line 1. He explained that she had bypassed my private number and started calling the main freight coordination desk. She was tying up the emergency logistics lines, screaming at the receptionists, and threatening to fire people who did not even work for her. I felt a muscle in my jaw tighten. The absolute audacity to disrupt the livelihood of hard-working people just to fuel her temper tantrum made my blood run cold. I told Mike to route the call to my desk and put it on speaker. I asked him to stay in the room. He walked over, placed the phone on the center of my mahogany desk, and pressed the glowing green button. Immediately, a shrill, hysterical voice filled the quiet office. Natalie was screaming my name, demanding to know why my useless employees were hanging up on her. She did not ask how I was. She did not apologize for the email she sent the night before. She launched directly into a frantic, breathless tirade about the greatest humiliation of her life. She screamed that my incompetent bank had made a catastrophic error. She demanded that I leave my filthy warehouse, immediately drive to the corporate banking branch, and force the manager to manually push the $700,000 wire transfer through to the Parisian escrow account. Her voice grew louder, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. She ranted about how Antoine and his mother were having a nervous breakdown in the east wing of the chateau. She cried about how the high-end caterers were threatening to pull the contract for the rehearsal dinner. She told me to stop playing games, to stop being so stubbornly Midwestern, and to fix the massive banking mistake before she was permanently embarrassed in front of European royalty. She was completely oblivious to the reality of the situation. She genuinely believed this was just a bureaucratic glitch preventing her from accessing what she viewed as her rightful money. I let her scream. I sat back in my leather chair, crossing my arms over my chest, and I just listened to the sheer panic in her voice. Mike shifted uncomfortably on his feet, looking anywhere but at the speakerphone. He knew how hard I had worked for that girl, and he was witnessing the exact monster I had funded. Natalie continued her verbal assault. She said she had tried to use her corporate platinum card to pay a temporary retainer to the venue management, but the transaction was declined. She called the credit card company garbage. She called the customer service representatives idiots. She demanded that I authorize a temporary lift on her spending limits. She insisted she needed at least $50,000 by the end of the hour just to keep the floral arrangers from walking off the estate grounds. She promised she would deal with my banking staff when she returned from her honeymoon, but for now I needed to drop everything and serve her needs. She then brought up her future in-laws again. She said Genevieve was already judging the delay and whispering about the unreliability of American money. Natalie was hyperventilating, trying to explain how delicate the situation was. She begged me to call the chateau directly and apologize for my banking error, but she firmly reminded me to only speak to the English translator so I would not embarrass her with my lack of refinement. Her arrogance was truly boundless. Even while begging for a financial bailout, she could not stop herself from insulting the hand that fed her. She finally paused to take a breath, demanding that I confirm I was on the line and that I was fixing the issue. The quiet in my office was heavy and absolute. I did not move. I let the silence stretch for 5 long seconds, letting her stew in the uncomfortable void. I looked at Mike, who was staring at the phone with a mixture of shock and disgust. I leaned forward and rested my forearms on the desk. I spoke slowly and clearly, making sure every single syllable landed with maximum impact. I told her there was no bank error. I told her the corporate credit card was not malfunctioning. I told her the escrow account was not experiencing a glitch. The line went completely dead quiet. I could hear her ragged breathing through the speaker. She was processing the information, but her entitled mind was struggling to accept the brutal truth. She stammered, asking me what I meant. She asked if the bank was auditing the trust fund. She asked if there was a temporary hold on the family assets. I shattered her delusion right then and there. I told her I canceled the wire transfer myself. I told her I shredded the authorization form and instructed my attorney to legally sever her from every single corporate account and emergency fund. I told her she was completely and entirely cut off. The speakerphone emitted a strange, choked sound as Natalie tried to formulate a response. She could not comprehend that the endless fountain of wealth had simply been turned off by her own father. She sputtered and demanded an explanation, claiming she had a legal right to those funds. She told me I was ruining her life over nothing. She told me I was having a senior moment, and that she would call her own lawyers to force the transaction. Her panic was entirely selfish, devoid of any realization that her own cruel email had triggered this exact sequence of events. She was backed into a corner of her own making, and the walls were rapidly closing in around her. The silence on the speakerphone was absolute. I could hear the faint static of the international connection and the ragged, uneven sound of my daughter gasping for air. She was trying to form words, but her brain was short-circuiting. She had never been told no, not once in her 32 years of life. I kept my eyes fixed on the shipping manifests scattered across my mahogany desk. Mike stood frozen by the door, watching a father systematically dismantle his only child world. Finally, Natalie found her voice. It was barely a whisper, stripped of all its previous arrogance. She asked me why I was doing this. She begged me to tell her it was a sick joke. She said I was ruining the most important day of her life over a simple misunderstanding. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the profound sorrow that had kept me awake the entire night. I reached across my desk and woke up my computer monitor. I opened my private inbox. I told her there was absolutely no misunderstanding. I told her I was simply following her explicit instructions. I clicked on her message from the night before and began to read her exact words back to her. I spoke slowly and deliberately, enunciating every single syllable so they would echo perfectly in the quiet warehouse office. I read the part where she called my manners gruff and embarrassing. I read the sentence where she stated that my complete inability to speak French would humiliate her in front of her new aristocratic family. I read the exact paragraph where she banned me from boarding a plane to Paris because my mere presence would ruin the sophisticated image she had so carefully constructed for the DuPonts. I did not skip a single comma. I forced her to listen to the cruelty she had casually typed out from her luxury hotel room just 12 hours earlier. I paused, letting her own toxic words hang in the heavy air between us. I heard her start to sob through the speaker. It was a wet, pathetic sound. She tried to interrupt me. She tried to say she was just stressed about the wedding planning and that she did not mean any of it. She cried that Genevieve was putting an immense amount of pressure on her to host a flawless event to please the Parisian high society. She claimed she was just trying to protect me from their harsh judgment. I cut her off completely. I told her she was a coward who was perfectly willing to discard her own father to appease a family of broke strangers. I told her I spent 40 years inhaling diesel fumes and breaking my back on cold concrete floors just so she could pretend to be royalty. I reminded her that the $700,000 she so desperately needed was the direct result of the exact American blue-collar sweat she found so incredibly offensive. I told her it would be a terrible tragedy to taint such a pure, aristocratic bloodline with my filthy, unrefined money. I said I was simply doing her a massive favor by keeping my embarrassing Midwestern bank accounts far away from her pristine French chateau. Her crying turned into frantic hyperventilation. She realized the apologies were completely useless. The fake tears were bouncing right off the armor she had forced me to build. She demanded to know how she was supposed to pay the vendors who were currently waiting in the historic courtyard. She asked how she was supposed to look Antoine in the eye and tell him the venue was officially canceled. I told her that was a wonderful opportunity to test the true strength of their aristocratic love. I told her that if Antoine truly loved her for who she was, he would gladly marry her in a cheap city courthouse without a dime to her name. But we both knew exactly how the DuPont family would react to a penniless bride with no trust fund to loot. I told her to have a wonderful life in Paris, and I reached out to press the red button to end the call. But before my finger could touch the plastic console, she let out a blood-curdling scream of pure, unadulterated rage. The sorrow vanished instantly, replaced by vicious desperation. She screamed that she would not let me do this to her. She screamed that she had signed legal documents and that I was breaking the law. Natalie shrieked through the speakerphone. The sound was so shrill that Mike actually took a step back from the desk. She told me I was a criminal. She said I could not just pull the plug on a legally binding agreement because my feelings were hurt. She swore she had a signed promissory note from my corporate attorneys guaranteeing the $700,000 for the venue and the vendors. She promised to drag me into international court and freeze every single asset my company held until I was completely bankrupt. I let her empty her lungs. I let her throw every legal threat she could remember from her introductory college courses. She claimed she would sue me for breach of contract, for emotional distress, and for financial sabotage. She said she would hire the most vicious corporate litigators in Chicago and have them tear my logistics empire apart piece by piece. She was completely unhinged, throwing out words like injunction and garnishment as if they were magic spells that could somehow force my bank to open its vaults. I looked down at my hands. I remembered the exact document she was talking about. It was a preliminary letter of intent drafted by Warren Cole 6 months ago. It stated that the Gallagher Family Trust intended to cover the wedding expenses provided certain conditions were met. Conditions that included my final executive authorization, which I had just shredded into 1,000 tiny pieces. She had absolutely nothing. She had a meaningless piece of paper that held zero weight in any courtroom on earth. I leaned close to the microphone. I told her to go ahead and call her imaginary lawyers. I told her to read the fine print on that letter of intent and see exactly whose signature was required to execute the final transfer. I told her Warren Cole would have her amateur legal team laughed out of the judge chambers before they even filed the paperwork. Her breathing grew incredibly heavy. The panic was morphing into something reckless and dangerous. She realized the legal threats were not scaring me. The empty promises of lawsuits were falling completely flat against a man who spent his life battling vicious corporate monopolies. She needed a new tactic. She needed to intimidate me in person. She lowered her voice into a cold, venomous hiss. She told me I was a pathetic, bitter old man who was just jealous of her success. She said she was not going to let a jealous warehouse worker ruin her entry into the Parisian elite. She announced she was leaving the chateau immediately. She was dragging Antoine and his mother to the airport, and they were boarding the next available first-class flight straight to Chicago. She swore she was going to march directly into my filthy warehouse with her future mother-in-law and a team of attorneys. She said she would stand in the middle of my boardroom and refused to leave until I manually signed the release forms in front of everyone. She wanted to physically back me into a corner. She wanted to bring the entire aristocratic circus to my doorstep and humiliate me in my own place of business until I surrendered the money out of sheer embarrassment. She genuinely believed that bringing Genevieve Dupont to my headquarters would somehow intimidate me into submission. She thought my blue-collar roots made me weak against their supposedly superior pedigree. She thought bringing European high society to a Chicago loading dock would make me cower and apologize for my lack of refinement. She had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. She had no idea that my boardroom was built to break men with twice her intelligence and 10 times her power. I had spent decades negotiating with ruthless union bosses and cutthroat freight brokers. A furious bride and an arrogant Parisian mother-in-law were nothing but a minor distraction. I did not try to talk her out of it. I did not tell her it was a colossal waste of a transatlantic flight. I told her the weather in Chicago was currently freezing and that she should advise her new family to dress warmly for the occasion. I told her my office doors were always open during standard business hours. I told her I would even make sure the coffee was hot and fresh when she arrived with her entourage to collect her imaginary inheritance. Then I pressed the red button on the console and permanently severed the connection. The office fell back into a deep, comforting silence. Mike looked at me with wide eyes, completely speechless. I stood up from my leather chair and looked out the window at my fleet of trucks pulling out of the yard. The battle was no longer happening over an international phone line. The war was coming directly to my front door, and I was going to be completely ready for them. Mike quietly backed out of the office and closed the heavy wooden door behind him. I was completely alone again. The silence was thick and pressed against my ears after the hysterical screaming match. I turned my chair away from the window and looked at the corner of my mahogany desk. Sitting there, catching the pale morning light, was a simple silver picture frame. It was a photograph of Diane. It was taken 20 years ago, long before the illness came and stole her away. She was standing in front of our very first warehouse wearing a denim jacket and a smile that could cut through the coldest Chicago winter. She was the only person on earth who truly understood me. She was the only one who saw right through my stubborn pride. I reached out and picked up the silver frame. The metal was cool against my rough hands. I stared into her eyes, remembering a quiet evening in our old kitchen. It was the night before Natalie turned 18. I had just purchased a brand new luxury convertible for her birthday, eager to see her face light up. I was so proud of that car. I thought it proved I was a successful father. I thought it proved we had finally made it. But Diane did not smile when I showed her the keys. She sat at the kitchen table, her face pale and tired from her first round of treatments. She looked at the shiny keys, and then she looked at me with a profound, terrifying sadness. She told me I was making a terrible mistake. She said that by giving Natalie everything she ever pointed at, I was actively stealing her ability to appreciate the struggle. She warned me that if I never let our daughter scrape her knees, if I never let her fail and pull herself back up, she would grow to deeply resent the people who built the stairs. Diane told me that sheltering someone from reality does not make them grateful. It just makes them ruthless. I did not listen. I brushed off her warning. I wanted to be the hero. I wanted my money to be an impenetrable shield around my family. But staring at her photograph now, the brutal truth washed over me. I had built a monster entirely out of unconditional generosity. I had financed the exact arrogance that was currently flying across the Atlantic Ocean to tear me down. Diane had known. She had seen the future I was too blind to recognize. I brushed my thumb over the glass of the picture frame one last time. I whispered a quiet apology to the only woman I ever loved. Then I opened the bottom drawer of my heavy desk. I placed her photograph gently inside and pushed the drawer shut, turning the small brass key until it clicked. The grieving, guilt-ridden father was officially locked away. He had to be. A war was coming to my doorstep, and the father could not fight it. I needed to be the chief executive. I needed to be the man who built an empire out of nothing. I picked up my phone to call Warren Cole and prepare the boardroom. The ambush was set, and I was going to be waiting. It was exactly 10 in the morning when the heavy reinforced glass doors of my logistics headquarters practically rattled on their hinges. I was standing by the massive window overlooking the main shipping yard, watching 3 semi-trucks maneuver into the loading bays. The steady, rhythmic thrum of the diesel engines was abruptly broken by the sharp, frantic clicking of high heels on the concrete hallway outside my office. My door did not just open. It was shoved open with an aggressive force that bounced the brass handle against the drywall. There, framed by the doorway, stood my daughter, Natalie. Her face was flushed. Her hair was slightly windblown from the Chicago winter, and her eyes were wide with a frantic, wild desperation. She looked exactly like she did when she was 6 years old and had broken a neighbor's window, expecting me to immediately hand over my wallet to fix the damage. But she was not alone. Standing immediately behind her, wrapped in a sprawling mink coat that looked completely absurd against the industrial backdrop of my warehouse, was Genevieve Dupont, Antoine's mother, the matriarch of the supposedly grand Parisian aristocracy, the woman whose delicate sensibilities I was forbidden from offending. I did not move from my spot by the window. I simply turned and watched them cross the threshold of my office. Genevieve did not look at me. She looked around my office, her nose literally wrinkled in profound disgust, as if she had just stepped into an open sewer. She pulled a silk scarf from her designer handbag and pressed it lightly against her face, making a deliberate, highly theatrical show of shielding herself from the scent of engine oil and cardboard boxes that perpetually hung in the air. "Mon Dieu," she muttered, her voice dripping with absolute venomous elitism. "It smells like physical labor in here. It smells like sweat and desperation. Natalie, you did not prepare me for this level of profound degradation. Is this truly where your family fortune originates? In a dirty garage surrounded by grunting, uneducated peasants?" I let her words hang in the air. I did not raise my voice to defend my company. I did not point out that the grunting peasants she was casually insulting moved millions of tons of vital freight across the continent every single year. I let her reveal exactly who she was. Natalie pushed past her future mother-in-law and stomped directly to my mahogany desk. She slammed her hands down onto the polished wood, leaning forward so her face was inches from mine. "Dad," she hissed, her voice shaking with an ugly, entitled fury. "What are you doing?" "The bank manager downtown refused to see us. The corporate tellers claimed your accounts were permanently locked. Antoine is waiting in the rental car, freezing to death because he refuses to step foot in this filthy industrial park. You need to call your bankers right now and manually authorize the release of my trust fund." I looked at my daughter, the girl I had carried on my shoulders, the girl I had worked 80-hour weeks to protect. She was standing in the very building that had bought her every designer dress and luxury vacation she had ever known, and she was actively embarrassed by it. I slowly walked around the desk and pressed the intercom button on my console. I spoke clearly into the microphone. "Warren, you can come in now." Before Natalie could demand to know who I was calling, The side door connecting my office to the executive boardroom opened. Warren Cole stepped through the doorway, adjusting his tailored suit jacket and carrying a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He did not look at Natalie. He looked directly at Genevieve DuPont, with a cold, calculating predator's gaze. Natalie spun around, clearly caught off guard. She knew Warren. She knew he was my corporate attack dog, and she instantly recognized that his presence meant the situation had escalated far beyond a simple banking error. "Dad. What is Warren doing here?" she demanded, her voice cracking slightly. "I told you this is a private family matter involving my inheritance. I do not need your lawyers involved." I finally spoke. My voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of the paternal warmth she had exploited for decades. I told her it was absolutely a legal matter. I told her that she had brought her new aristocratic family to my doorstep, demanding a massive financial transaction, and I was simply ensuring all the appropriate corporate protocols were followed. I gestured toward the open door of the boardroom. I invited them to step inside. I told them we were going to sit down at the massive oak table and review the exact status of the Gallagher family trust. Genevieve scoffed loudly, pulling her mink coat tighter around her shoulders. "We are not sitting in some dreadful warehouse meeting room to discuss my son's wedding," she declared, her accent thick and arrogant. "We are here to collect the funds my family was promised. We are here to ensure this embarrassing American delay does not humiliate the DuPont legacy any further. You will sign the necessary banking papers, and we will immediately return to Paris where we belong." Warren Cole smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a shark that had just cornered a very loud, very naive seal. "Mrs. DuPont," Warren said, his voice dangerously smooth, "I highly suggest you step into the boardroom. I have some financial documents regarding your historic family vineyards that I believe you will find deeply fascinating. In fact, I think they might just change the entire trajectory of your son's upcoming marriage." The color instantly drained from Genevieve's face. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp look of pure, unadulterated panic. Natalie looked back and forth between her future mother-in-law and my attorney, completely oblivious to the massive bomb that was about to be dropped directly onto her fairy tale. I did not wait for them to argue. I walked into the boardroom, pulled out a leather chair, and sat at the head of the table. The ambush was fully set, and it was time to spring the trap. I did not say another word to either of them. I simply turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy oak double doors of the executive boardroom. I could hear the sharp, angry clatter of Genevieve's designer heels striking the concrete floor behind me, followed by Natalie's frantic, uneven footsteps. They were following me, driven by a toxic combination of arrogance and desperation. They honestly believed this was just a negotiation. They thought they could bully their way through the door and walk out with a $700,000 check. I pushed open the boardroom doors and stepped inside. The room was expansive, dominated by a massive, polished mahogany table that stretched almost 20 feet. The lighting was low and serious, a stark contrast to the bright, chaotic warehouse floor outside. At the far end of the table, illuminated by a single overhead spotlight, sat Warren Cole. Warren looked up as we entered. He did not stand. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto Genevieve DuPont. Resting on the polished wood directly in front of him was a thick, dark leather portfolio. It looked heavy. It looked official. It looked like a weapon. I walked over and took my seat at the head of the table, gesturing for the two women to sit opposite me. Natalie practically threw herself into a chair, her face flushed, her breathing shallow and rapid. Genevieve remained standing for a long moment, looking around the boardroom, with an expression of profound disdain, as if sitting in one of my chairs might somehow infect her with poverty. Finally, with an exaggerated theatrical sigh, she lowered herself into the seat, carefully arranging her mink coat so it would not touch the armrests. "Well," Genevieve snapped, her French accent thick and dripping with impatience, "let us conclude this absurd American theater. We have a flight to catch, and my son is waiting in the cold. Where are the bank authorizations?" Warren Cole did not look at me. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on Genevieve. He reached out with one hand and slowly opened the thick leather portfolio. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft, crisp sound of heavy parchment paper turning. Mrs. DuPont Warren began, his voice perfectly smooth and dangerously calm. My name is Warren Cole. I am the Chief Legal Counsel for Gallagher Logistics and the primary executor of the Gallagher Family Trust. He paused, letting the title hang in the air for a second. My client has instructed me to inform you that the $700,000 wire transfer to the Chateau de Versailles has been permanently canceled. Natalie let out a sharp, strangled gasp, but Warren did not even glance in her direction. He pulled a single, formally drafted document from the portfolio and slid it smoothly across the mahogany table. It stopped precisely between Natalie and Genevieve. Furthermore, Warren continued his tone, shifting from informative to surgical. The specific trust account intended to cover the wedding expenses has been completely dissolved. The funds no longer exist in that capacity. Every corporate credit line, emergency travel fund, and international access account previously authorized under Natalie's name was officially terminated at 6 o'clock this morning. I watched Natalie's face. The arrogance completely vanished, replaced by an expression of raw, unadulterated shock. She looked down at the document on the table. It was a formal notice of financial severance. It was covered in legal seals and authorized signatures. It was undeniable proof that the money was gone. Genevieve leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of the table. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, her voice rising in pitch. This is unacceptable. This girl promised my family that her inheritance was secure. Are you telling me she is destitute? Warren smiled. It was a terrifying smile. Oh, it is much worse than that, Mrs. DuPont. He reached back into the portfolio and pulled out a second, much thicker stack of papers. He dropped it onto the table with a heavy, satisfying thud. I believe it is time we discuss the financial realities of your historic family vineyards and why you are so desperately reliant on a fake American heiress to save you from foreclosure. Genevieve stared at the thick stack of documents on the mahogany table as if it were a venomous snake. The arrogant posture she had carried into my warehouse evaporated in a single instant. She pulled her mink coat tighter around her throat, but the chill in the boardroom had nothing to do with the Chicago winter outside. Natalie was hyperventilating now, her eyes darting between Warren and the papers, still clinging to the delusion that she could somehow negotiate her way out of this nightmare. She opened her mouth to argue, but Warren raised a single hand, silencing her with the casual authority of a man who held her entire future in his briefcase. He spoke directly to Natalie, his voice completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. He explained that the Gallagher Family Trust was constructed with a discretionary revocation clause. It was a clause she had never bothered to read because she never believed she would be held accountable for her actions. Warren informed her that it gave me, as the sole grantor, the absolute right to liquidate, transfer, or dissolve any designated funds, without prior notice, provided the beneficiary had not yet assumed legal possession. Warren leaned forward and told her that the $700,000 was never hers. It was a conditional gift, and the conditions were just permanently revoked. He detailed exactly how the escrow accounts were drained, the banking routing numbers deactivated, and her signature authority erased from every corporate registry on Earth. She was cut off. There were no loopholes, no grace periods, and no secret safety nets left to catch her. Natalie slumped back in her heavy leather chair, the fight completely draining out of her body. The crushing reality was finally setting in. There would be no royal wedding. There would be no Parisian castle, and there would be no high society debut. But the destruction of my daughter's fairy tale was only the first half of the execution. I turned my attention away from Natalie and locked my eyes directly onto Genevieve DuPont. Her face was incredibly pale, the heavy makeup completely unable to hide the sudden sharp lines of panic forming around her mouth. It was time for her to understand exactly whose warehouse she had just insulted. I leaned my elbows on the polished table and let a low, humorless sigh escape my chest. I told Mrs. DuPont that I found her aristocratic pride absolutely fascinating, especially for a woman whose ancestral estate was currently on the verge of being padlocked by the French government. I watched her breath catch in her throat. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, devastating certainty of a man who had read her entire financial history over his morning coffee. I told her Warren had run a deep international audit on the DuPont family holdings, and what we found was nothing short of a spectacular financial tragedy. I laid out the facts methodically, giving her absolutely no room to deny them. I told her I knew her historic vineyards had been operating at a massive loss for 5 consecutive years. I knew about the 3 separate international bank loans they had defaulted on. I knew about the severe tax liens threatening to swallow their precious chateau whole. They were entirely bankrupt, drowning in generations of hidden debt and terrible management. I told her I knew exactly why they had welcomed a loud, unrefined American girl into their pristine family tree. They were actively hunting for a bailout, and Natalie had paraded my bank accounts in front of them like a glowing neon rescue flare. Genevieve tried to speak, tried to summon that venomous elitism she had weaponized just 10 minutes earlier, but the words died in her throat. She looked at Natalie not with maternal affection, but with the cold, calculating fury of a grifter who realizes she just got conned by a fellow amateur. They had mutually scammed each other. Natalie thought she was buying a royal title, and Genevieve thought she was securing an infinite American trust fund. I looked Genevieve dead in the eye and told her that her rescue boat had just officially sunk, and my filthy, uneducated peasant money was staying exactly where it belonged, right here in Chicago. Genevieve slowly turned her head away from the damning financial documents and locked her gaze onto my daughter. The delicate facade of European aristocratic grace completely vanished in an instant. Her perfectly manicured features twisted into an expression of raw, unadulterated revulsion. She did not see a future daughter-in-law sitting across the mahogany table anymore. She saw a useless, empty bank account wrapped in stolen designer clothing. She realized the grand American rescue mission she had banked her entire family legacy on was a complete hallucination. She had flown across the Atlantic Ocean only to discover she was attempting to extract water from a completely dry stone. Genevieve stood up from the heavy leather chair, smoothing the front of her expensive mink coat, with hands that were visibly shaking from suppressed rage. She looked down at Natalie, and her voice was no longer masked by polite societal charm. She called my daughter a pathetic, deceitful fraud. She told her that she was nothing but a cheap Midwestern imposter who had dared to waste the precious time of the DuPont family. She explicitly stated that without the $700,000 venue payment and the guarantee of future wealth, Natalie was completely worthless to their historic lineage. It was breathtaking to watch the sheer transactional nature of their relationship laid bare under the harsh boardroom lights. The illusion of genuine romance evaporated instantly, leaving only the ugly reality of a failed business merger. Natalie tried to reach out across the table and grab the sleeve of the mink coat, begging Genevieve to listen. She promised she could fix the situation and pleaded that they could still have a beautiful, intimate wedding in a smaller location. Genevieve snatched her arm away as if she had just been touched by a diseased animal. She loudly declared that there would be absolutely no wedding of any size anywhere on Earth. She announced that the engagement was officially and permanently terminated right then and there. She told Natalie to never attempt to contact Antoine again. She made it perfectly clear that the prestigious DuPont name would never be associated with a family of filthy, lying warehouse workers. Genevieve spun around on her designer heels and marched briskly toward the boardroom doors. She shouted over her shoulder that she was going to retrieve her son from the freezing rental car outside and that they were heading straight back to the international airport. She did not look back even once. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, leaving a devastatingly quiet void in their wake. The massive collision of 2 desperate, greedy worlds had ended in total, absolute disaster. I remained seated at the head of the table, watching my daughter absorb the absolute destruction of the fake life she had so desperately tried to build. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked shut, sealing Natalie inside a profound, suffocating silence. The click echoed off the mahogany paneling, sounding exactly like a vault locking into place. Genevieve and Antoine were gone. The grand aristocratic escape hatch had vanished, leaving only the cold reality of a Chicago winter and an empty bank account. Natalie stood frozen near the edge of the table, her breath hitching in her chest as the magnitude of her sudden poverty crashed over her. The immaculate posture, the haughty tilt of her chin, the carefully rehearsed French affectations, they all crumbled instantly. She looked incredibly small, a terrified child playing dress-up in adult clothing. I remained seated at the head of the table, watching the devastating collapse of her manufactured identity. Warren Cole quietly collected the financial documents, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He didn't spare her a single glance. Natalie's eyes darted around the room, frantic searching for an anchor that no longer existed. She looked at the expensive leather chairs, the polished wood, the sprawling industrial yard, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. This was the foundation she had so arrogantly dismissed as filthy and unrefined. And now it was the only reality left. "Dad!" she whimpered, her voice trembling, stripped of all its former venom. She took a hesitant step toward me, her hands twisting nervously in the fabric of her designer skirt. The transformation was absolute. The vicious, entitled woman who had screamed demands through a speakerphone just an hour ago was entirely gone. In her place stood a desperate, manipulative actor shifting into her most reliable role, the helpless victim. She let out a ragged sob, genuine tears finally spilling over her carefully applied makeup. "Dad, please. You have to help me. You have to call them back. We can fix this. I'll apologize to Antoine. I'll apologize to Genevieve. Just tell them the money is still there. Tell them it was a mistake." She collapsed into the chair nearest to me, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. It was a performance I had witnessed countless times over the last decade. Whenever a credit card was declined, whenever a luxury vehicle was scratched, whenever a consequence dared to approach her, she deployed this exact routine. The tears were real, but the sorrow was entirely selfish. She was not crying for the pain she had caused. She was grieving the loss of her pristine, unearned lifestyle. "I know I was cruel," she wept, peering up at me through tear-stained fingers. "I know that email was awful, but you don't understand the pressure, Dad. You don't know what it's like to try and survive in their world." Genevieve is ruthless. She scrutinizes everything. I just wanted to be perfect for them. I just wanted them to accept me. She reached out across the dark mahogany, her manicured fingers trembling, seeking the familiar comfort of a father who always surrendered. "Dad, I love him. I really love Antoine. Please, you can't let my engagement die like this. If you just authorize the wire transfer, I promise I'll be better. I'll pay you back. I'll get a job in Paris. I'll do whatever you want. Just please, please don't let them walk away thinking I'm a fraud." Her pleas echoed in the quiet room, a desperate symphony of manipulation. She was utilizing every emotional lever she had spent 32 years calibrating. She spoke of love, of impossible societal pressure, of desperate promises to change. She wielded her vulnerability like a scalpel, attempting to carve her way past the armor I had finally bolted into place. I looked down at her outstretched, trembling hand. I thought of Diane's warning whispering from the past. I thought of the brutal, icy mornings on the loading dock, lifting crates until my spine felt like shattered glass. I looked at the daughter I had broken myself to provide for, and I realized with absolute clarity that I felt absolutely nothing. The well of unconditional forgiveness was permanently dry. I did not reach out to hold her hand. I did not offer a word of comfort. I simply leaned back in my leather chair, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating. The tears continued to flow, her sobs echoing louder in the vacuum of my refusal. She was drowning in the consequences of her own arrogance, and for the first time in her life, I was absolutely unwilling to throw her a life preserver. I watched her wipe the tears from her cheeks with the back of her trembling hand. I let the silence stretch out until the sound of her crying faded into quiet, pathetic hiccups. I did not move from my chair. I looked at the polished wood of the boardroom table, and then I looked directly into her eyes. I told her to save her tears because they were no longer a valid currency in this building. I told her that she was not crying because she felt remorse for casting me aside. She was crying because her golden parachute had just failed to open, and she was plummeting toward the concrete floor of reality. She tried to interrupt me to offer another hollow excuse, but I leaned forward and held up my hand. She stopped speaking immediately. I told her it was my turn to speak, and she was going to listen to every single word. I held out my hands, holding them flat above the dark mahogany table. I told her to look at them. I told her to look at the thick scars across my knuckles and the joints swollen from decades of freezing weather. I asked her if she remembered the winters in Chicago during the early 80s. I told her she probably did not remember them because she was asleep under a heavy down comforter in a heated house while I was standing on a concrete loading dock at 3 in the morning. I described the sensation of ice biting through cheap work gloves. I described the grinding agony in my lower back from lifting heavy wooden crates for 14 hours straight just to make overtime pay. I told her every single ache and every permanent injury in my body was purchased directly to fund her childhood comfort. I reminded her of the elite private academy she begged to attend when she was 13 years old. I reminded her how she cried for 3 days straight because all her wealthy friends were going to that school and she felt left out. I told her I took a second mortgage on our small house to pay that exorbitant tuition. I described how I used to park my rusted delivery truck 2 blocks away from the campus gates when I picked her up because she told me the exhaust fumes embarrassed her. I told her I knew she lied to her classmates and told them I was just a hired driver. I knew it back then, and I swallowed my pride because I mistakenly believed I was providing her with a better future. I spoke about her mother. I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to let the emotion crack my composure. I reminded Natalie that Diane clipped grocery coupons and wore the same winter coat for 7 years so that Natalie could spend her summers taking art classes in Europe. I told her we sacrificed our own comfort, our own vacations, and our own peace of mind to build a fortress of privilege around her. We gave her a life completely devoid of struggle. We shielded her from the harshness of the world, and in return she grew up to view us as nothing more than an embarrassing bank account. I watched the color completely drain from her face. She was staring at my hands, unable to look me in the eye. I continued dismantling the illusion she had spent her entire adult life defending. I told her she had never been an independent woman. I told her she was a 32-year-old child playing dress-up with my credit cards. I listed the expensive realities she had completely ignored for years. I mentioned the luxury apartment rent I quietly covered every single month. I mentioned the designer clothes she bought to impress people who did not actually care about her. I pointed out that she had never worked a single hour of manual labor. She had never worried about keeping the lights on. She had never faced a problem that she could not just swipe away with a piece of corporate plastic. I told her she had built an entire personality around being superior to the working class, while actively draining the lifeblood of a working-class man. She went to Paris and pretended to be an aristocrat. She sat in historic chateaux and drank expensive champagne with families who looked down on the very people keeping them afloat. I told her the supreme irony was that she was just as broke as the desperately indebted family she was trying to marry into. She was a complete fraud, and the moment the money stopped flowing, her entire identity evaporated into thin air. She opened her mouth to beg again, but the words simply died in her throat. The brutal honesty of the situation left her completely defenseless. I told her that her email had finally opened my eyes to my own profound failure as a father. I told her I read the part where she called my manners unrefined and my presence a humiliation. I told her she was absolutely right. My money was not refined. My money was dirty. My money was covered in diesel soot and warehouse dust and the honest sweat of laborers she considered beneath her. I told her it was a terrible injustice to force her to rely on such filthy American money. I told her I was simply granting her ultimate wish. I was removing the embarrassment from her life, permanently. I told her she was finally free to be the sophisticated, independent Parisian socialite she always claimed to be. But she was going to have to do it without a single penny from the father she was too ashamed to invite to her own wedding. I told her the free ride was officially over. I told her she was finally going to learn how much a gallon of milk actually costs. She was going to learn what it feels like to wake up terrified about paying rent. She was going to learn what actual exhaustive work looks like. The reckoning had finally arrived, and there was absolutely no way for her to escape it. The tears stopped completely. The realization that crying was not going to open the bank vault changed her entire posture. The sorrow evaporated from her face, replaced by the cornered, vicious desperation of an animal that suddenly realizes it is trapped. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, and her eyes hardened into narrow, bitter slits. She told me that if I was going to treat her like a cold business transaction, she was going to act exactly like one. She stood up, leaning her weight over the mahogany table. She said she knew people. She said she had friends at major Chicago publications, society blogs, and local television stations. She threatened to walk straight out of my warehouse and go directly to the media to completely ruin my corporate reputation. She would tell the press I was a tyrannical, abusive monster who financially manipulated and abandoned his only daughter. She would publicly claim I maliciously sabotaged her wedding out of pure jealous spite because she was marrying into a better class of people. She said my logistics company relied heavily on public goodwill and municipal contracts, and a massive family scandal portraying me as a cruel, vindictive billionaire would send my contracts plummeting and my board of directors into an absolute panic. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice to defend my company. I knew the local press did not care about a spoiled 32-year-old woman complaining that her father had finally stopped paying her credit card bills. But before I could even tell her to go ahead and make the phone call, Warren Cole shifted in his heavy leather chair. Warren let out a sharp, dry laugh. It was a sound that had made opposing counsel sweat in courtrooms across the entire country. He closed his thick leather portfolio and looked at Natalie with utter, unapologetic contempt. He told her she had a very active imagination, but a profound and dangerous misunderstanding of how the legal system actually worked. He reached out and opened a thin manila folder resting near his right hand. He pulled out 2 crisp, legally binding documents and slid them smoothly across the polished table until they rested directly in front of her shaking hands. Warren explained exactly what those papers were. The first was a comprehensive, ironclad, non-disclosure agreement. He told her that if she spoke to a single journalist, posted a single social media update, or even whispered a disparaging word about James Gallagher or his company to a stranger on the street, he would bury her in litigation. He promised to sue her for defamation, libel, and corporate sabotage. He told her he would personally ensure she spent the rest of her natural life buried under a mountain of legal debt, so massive she would never see daylight again. The second document, Warren explained, was a final severance package from the Gallagher Family Trust. He told her she had 2 options, and she was going to make her choice before she walked out of the boardroom doors. If she signed the non-disclosure agreement, she would receive a heavily monitored monthly stipend. It was not enough to buy designer shoes or charter private jets to Paris. It was just enough to rent a very modest apartment and buy basic groceries. But the stipend came with brutal, non-negotiable conditions. Warren listed the terms with ruthless efficiency. She was required to enroll in and pass a certified financial literacy course. She was required to maintain a full-time 40-hour-a-week job, verifiable by pay stubs submitted directly to his law office every single month. If she quit the job, the money stopped. If she failed the class, the money stopped. If she missed a single reporting deadline, the money permanently stopped. It was not a gift. It was a strict, unyielding leash designed to force her into reality. Warren leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the table. He told her the second option was much simpler. She could refuse to sign. She could turn around, walk out of the warehouse, and go try to pitch her sob story to the local news. But if she chose that door, she would walk out with absolutely nothing. $0. No apartment, no car, no phone plan, and no safety net. She would be completely homeless by midnight, and she would have the full terrifying weight of my legal department hunting her down the second she opened her mouth to the press. Natalie stared down at the 2 pieces of paper. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to press them against her legs. She looked at Warren, and then she looked at me. She was searching my face for a bluff. She was searching for a tiny crack in my armor, a sign that I was just trying to scare her. But she found absolutely nothing. She realized she was not negotiating with a loving father anymore. She was sitting across from a chief executive and his lead attorney, and she had just been handed the final non-negotiable terms of her surrender. I watched Natalie stare at the 2 crisp sheets of paper resting on the dark mahogany table. The ambient hum of the warehouse below seemed to fade entirely, leaving only the sound of her rapid, shallow breathing. She looked like a cornered animal trying to calculate a way out of a steel cage. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished wood, and I told her the time for negotiation was permanently over. I told her Warren had explained the legal mechanics of her situation, but I was going to explain the reality of her new life. I spoke with a quiet, unwavering certainty that left absolutely no room for interpretation. I told her the first document was her only lifeline. It was a severance package, but it was not the multi-million-dollar golden parachute she always assumed would catch her. I told her that if she signed on the dotted line, the Gallagher Family Trust would issue her a highly restricted stipend of exactly $2,000 a month. I paused, letting that specific number echo in the cavernous boardroom. I watched her eyes widen in sheer horror. She opened her mouth to protest, to tell me that $2,000 would not even cover a fraction of her previous monthly wardrobe allowance, but I raised my hand and silenced her instantly. I told her I knew exactly what $2,000 bought in a city like Chicago. It bought a cramped, drafty studio apartment in a neighborhood she had never previously dared to drive through. It bought generic brand groceries, a monthly transit pass, and just enough electricity to keep the lights on. It meant waiting for the bus in the freezing slush instead of summoning a private car. It meant washing her own clothes at a coin-operated laundromat down the street instead of utilizing a luxury concierge service. I told her she would never see the inside of a high-end boutique or a luxury spa again. The days of swiping a platinum card for a $500 dinner were officially buried. Her Parisian aristocratic fantasy was dead, and she was going to learn how to survive at the very bottom of the American working class. But I told her the money was not a gift. It was a tightly controlled leash, and I was holding the other end. I detailed the brutal, non-negotiable conditions attached to that meager stipend. I told her the first requirement was mandatory enrollment in a certified financial literacy course. She was going to sit in a sterile classroom twice a week and learn how to balance a basic checkbook. She was going to learn what an interest rate actually meant, and she was going to learn how to budget for a utility bill. I told her Warren Cole would receive her attendance records directly from the instructor. If she missed a single class, if she showed up late, or if she failed an exam, the $2,000 would vanish overnight without a single warning. I did not stop there. I pushed the reality even further. I told her the second requirement was immediate full-time employment. She was going to find a job that required her to clock in and work a minimum of 40 hours a week. I told her I did not care if she poured coffee, folded clothes in a retail store, or swept floors. She was going to learn exactly how much physical exhaustion went into earning minimum wage. I leaned closer to her across the table, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. I told her about my very first job. I was 19 years old, working the graveyard shift at a meatpacking plant on the south side. I spent 9 hours a night hauling frozen boxes that weighed more than I did, my hands numb and bleeding inside cheap canvas gloves. I told her I earned $3.35 an hour. I saved every single penny in a rusted coffee can until I could finally afford the down payment on my very first delivery truck. I told her that truck was the foundation of the empire she had been looting for a decade. She was going to experience that exact same grind. She was going to submit her pay stubs to Warren Cole every 2 weeks. If she quit the job, the stipend stopped. If she was fired for insubordination, the stipend stopped. If she tried to forge a single document, the stipend permanently disappeared. Natalie looked at me as if I had just sentenced her to a slow execution. Her hands were gripping the armrests of her leather chair so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She tried to swallow, but her throat was dry. She whispered that she could not do it. She claimed she had no marketable skills, no resume, and no idea how to navigate the life I was describing. I told her she was a smart woman who had managed to orchestrate a massive international deception, so she could certainly figure out how to operate a cash register. I told her the choice was entirely hers. She could sign the paperwork, accept the terms, and finally learn how to survive as an independent adult. Then I pointed to the second document on the table, the non-disclosure agreement. I told her that was the ultimate shield protecting my company from her desperate threats. I explained exactly what would happen if she refused to sign. I told her she could stand up, turn around, and walk out of the boardroom right now. She could go straight to the local news stations just like she threatened. She could try to drag my name through the mud and paint me as the villain. But I warned her to consider the consequences with absolute clarity. I told her that if she chose that path, she would walk out of my warehouse with $0 to her name. Her corporate accounts were already drained. Her apartment lease was already canceled. She would be completely homeless the moment the sun set over the city. I told her Warren Cole had already drafted a massive defamation countersuit. The second she uttered my name to a journalist, my legal team would freeze every asset she ever touched. We would subpoena her communications, expose her fraudulent claims to the DuPont family, and drag her entire desperate charade into the brutal light of a public courtroom. I told her she would spend the next decade drowning in legal fees she could never afford to pay. I told her no judge in the state would side with an entitled 32-year-old woman trying to extort her father after sending a written email banning him from a wedding he was actively funding. She would be utterly ruined, publicly humiliated, and permanently destitute. The silence in the boardroom was suffocating. I watched the last remaining sparks of defiance extinguish in her eyes. The grand illusion was completely shattered. There were no hidden rescue boats, no secret trust funds, and no aristocratic saviors waiting in the wings. There was only the cold, hard reality of my terms and the terrifying abyss of absolute poverty if she refused them. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a heavy silver pen. It was the exact same pen I had almost used to sign away $700,000 just 24 hours earlier. I placed it deliberately on top of the legal documents. The metal clinked sharply against the polished wood. I sat back in my chair and folded my hands. I told her the clock was ticking. I told her to pick up the pen, sign her name, and accept the consequences of her profound arrogance, or to stand up and walk out of my building with nothing but the clothes on her back. I did not blink. I did not soften my gaze. I waited in absolute silence for my daughter to make the most important decision of her entire life. The heavy silver pen rested on the legal documents, catching the pale light that filtered through the warehouse windows. The silence in the executive boardroom was absolute, stretching out into a vast, suffocating void. Neither Warren Cole nor I moved a single muscle. We simply sat across the expansive mahogany table watching the last remnants of an arrogant illusion evaporate into the cold Chicago air. Natalie stared down at the pen as if it were a loaded weapon. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow jerks, her breathing the only human sound in the massive room. The vibrant, indignant flush that had colored her cheeks just moments ago was entirely gone. Her skin was now a sickly, translucent white. She was completely trapped, pinned down by the undeniable reality of her situation. The grand Parisian escape she had banked her entire existence on had vanished. The aristocratic family she had desperately tried to impress had abandoned her the second they realized she was financially empty. She had absolutely no leverage left to pull. There was no secret account to drain, no generous relative to manipulate, and no public relations threat that could possibly penetrate the legal fortress Warren had constructed around my company. For her entire adult life, Natalie had utilized crying as her ultimate defense mechanism. Tears were her currency, her reliable method for melting my resolve and forcing me to open my wallet. But as she looked up from the documents and searched my face one final time, she finally understood that the currency was completely worthless. Her eyes, red and swollen, scoured my expression for a sliver of the father who used to buy her affection. She was looking for a sign of hesitation, a subtle softening of my jaw, a hint that I was merely trying to teach her a temporary lesson before ultimately surrendering. She found absolutely nothing. I offered her a gaze as hard and unyielding as the concrete floor of the loading dock below us. I was no longer her safety net. I was the architect of her new, unforgiving reality. The ambient noises of the logistics headquarters began to bleed through the soundproofed walls, underscoring the absolute finality of the moment. The low, guttural rumble of a diesel engine vibrating in the shipping yard. The faint, metallic clang of a forklift dropping a heavy pallet. These were the sounds of honest, grueling labor. These were the sounds of the working-class world she had spent her entire life despising and attempting to outrun. Now those very sounds served as the ticking metronome of her defeat. She was about to join the ranks of the people she had called unrefined peasants. She was about to learn the physical weight of an hourly wage. The irony hung heavy in the room, thick enough to choke on. Natalie slowly raised her right hand. Her fingers were trembling so violently that she had to brace her wrist against the edge of the polished mahogany table just to steady herself. Her perfectly manicured nails, painted a soft, expensive pink for a wedding that would never happen, hovered over the heavy silver pen. She hesitated. For 3 agonizing seconds, her hand froze in midair. It was the final, desperate rebellion of a pampered ego refusing to accept its own demise. She closed her eyes tightly, perhaps hoping that when she opened them, she would wake up in her luxury hotel suite wrapped in silk sheets and discover this was all just a terrifying nightmare. She opened her eyes. The boardroom was still there. The legal documents were still there. The cold, unblinking stares of her father and his attorney were still there. She lowered her hand and wrapped her trembling fingers around the barrel of the silver pen. The metal was heavy and cold, a stark physical reminder of the gravity of what she was about to do. She pulled the pen toward her, dragging it across the smooth wood until the tip rested directly above the first signature line. It was the non-disclosure agreement, the document that permanently stripped her of her voice, barring her from ever attempting to smear my name or weaponize her fabricated victimhood against my corporate reputation. The boardroom was so quiet that the acoustic details of her surrender became incredibly loud. The sharp, distinct scratch of the pen biting into the thick parchment paper filled the room. It was a slow, deliberate, agonizing sound. Each stroke of the pen tore away another layer of her manufactured royalty. I watched the black ink flow from the silver tip, spelling out her name in a shaky, uneven script that looked nothing like her usual confident signature. It looked like the handwriting of a frightened, exhausted stranger. The scratching noise seemed to echo a harsh, scraping friction that sounded exactly like a crown being violently dragged across a stone floor. She finished the first signature. She did not look up. She kept her head bowed, her blonde hair falling forward to hide her face, as if the physical act of looking at me would cause her to shatter completely. She moved her trembling hand to the second document. The severance package. The contract that legally bound her to a highly restricted $2,000 monthly stipend, mandatory financial literacy classes, and verifiable full-time minimum wage employment. This was the document that officially locked the door to her past and shoved her out into the cold, unforgiving reality of the real world. The pen scratched against the paper again. The sound was even slower this time, every single letter representing a massive, humiliating concession. She was signing away the designer handbags. She was signing away the private cars, the international vacations, and the luxury apartment overlooking the city. She was legally binding herself to the grueling, exhausting, completely ordinary life she had considered a fate worse than death. The final stroke of the pen trailed off slightly at the end, the ink smudging as her hand finally gave out from the tension. She carefully placed the silver pen back down onto the mahogany table. It rolled an inch before coming to a complete stop, the metal clinking softly against the wood. The transaction was officially complete. The legal bindings were secure. The transition of power was absolute. Natalie pushed the two signed documents across the table toward Warren Cole. She pushed them slowly, her fingertips lingering on the edges of the paper for a fraction of a second before letting go. Warren reached out and pulled the folders toward his chest. He did not say thank you. He did not offer a polite, professional courtesy. He simply opened his briefcase, slid the documents safely inside, and snapped the brass locks shut. That sharp, metallic click was the final sound of her defeat. The arrogant heiress who had sent that cruel, dismissive email just 24 hours ago was officially dead. Sitting across from me was just an adult woman with zero leverage, zero assets, and a very difficult road ahead of her. I reached out and pressed the brass button on my intercom console. The small red light illuminated, cutting through the heavy atmosphere of the room. I spoke clearly into the microphone, asking the front desk to send up 2 members of our building security detail. I did not ask for Mike this time. I asked for the uniformed guards who handled unauthorized personnel. Natalie flinched at the word security. It was the final, undeniable proof that her status in this building had fundamentally changed. She was no longer the heiress apparent. She was no longer the boss's daughter who could waltz through the doors and demand whatever she wanted. She was simply a civilian who had concluded her business and now needed to be escorted off the premises. The wait was brief. Less than a minute later, the heavy oak doors opened. 2 guards stepped into the boardroom. They were tall, broad-shouldered men wearing dark blue uniforms. They stopped a few feet from the table, their hands clasped in front of them, waiting for my instruction. I looked at Natalie and nodded toward the door. I told her the meeting was officially over. I told her my guards would ensure she found her way to the front exit safely. Natalie slowly stood up from the leather chair. Her legs looked unsteady, trembling slightly beneath the hem of her expensive, tailored skirt. She did not say a word. There were no more insults left to throw, no more tears to weaponize, and absolutely no more threats to leverage. She picked up her designer handbag, the leather suddenly looking absurdly out of place, and turned toward the door. She did not look back at me. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, staring blankly at the wood paneling as the 2 guards stepped to either side of her, forming a polite but impenetrable escort. I watched her walk out of the boardroom. I listened to the sound of her high heels clicking against the floorboards, growing fainter as she moved down the hallway toward the metal staircase. From my chair, I could imagine her descending those grated steps, walking directly above the massive concrete expanse of the warehouse floor. She was walking past the rows of wooden pallets, past the roaring forklifts, past the men and women wearing heavy canvas jackets and steel-toed boots. She had spent her entire life running away from this exact environment, treating the grit and grime of honest labor as a contagious disease. Now she was being marched right through the middle of it, stripped of the unearned wealth that had previously shielded her from the real world. The heavy glass doors at the main entrance opened, and a violent gust of freezing Chicago wind swept into the lobby. I stood up and walked over to my office window, looking down at the parking lot below. I watched my daughter step out onto the gray, salt-stained pavement. There was no sleek black town car waiting for her with the engine running. There was no arrogant Parisian fiancé waiting to open her door. The parking lot was empty, save for the fleet of delivery trucks and the cars belonging to my employees. She stood there for a long moment, shivering, as the brutal winter air cut right through her thin silk blouse. She looked up and down the desolate industrial street, realizing that the nearest bus stop was 4 blocks away. She began to walk. Her pace was slow and defeated, her head bowed against the biting wind. I watched her figure grow smaller and smaller, disappearing into the gray, unforgiving landscape of the city. Inside the boardroom, the suffocating tension that had gripped my chest for the past hour finally began to dissolve. It did not vanish in a sudden rush of relief. It bled out slowly, leaving a profound, hollow quiet in its wake. The adrenaline that had fueled my confrontation completely faded, leaving me with a deep, bone-tiring exhaustion. The war was officially over. The battlefield was clear. Warren Cole picked up his briefcase, the brass locks snapping shut with a crisp finality. He offered me a single, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the brutal necessity of what we had just accomplished. Then he walked out, leaving me entirely alone in the massive room. I walked back to the head of the table and stood there in the quiet. I had just dismantled the life of my only child. I had burned her fairy tale to the ground and sent her out into the freezing cold with nothing but a strict allowance and a harsh lesson in survival. I felt the immense heavy sorrow of a father who had lost his daughter to greed, but I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I knew the cold reality of her new impoverished independence was the only medicine that could ever cure the sickness I had helped create. I breathed in the scent of diesel and cardboard filtering through the vents, feeling a deep, solid peace settling over my soul. The illusion was gone, and for the first time in 32 years, the truth was finally standing on its own. 3 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of the boardroom closed on the hardest decision I ever had to make. The brutal Chicago winter had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, biting spring chill that swept through the open bays of the main warehouse. I stood on the elevated metal walkway, gripping the cold steel railing, looking down at the massive expanse of my logistics headquarters. It was just past 6 in the morning, and the early shift was already operating at maximum capacity. The air was thick with the familiar comforting scent of diesel exhaust, hot rubber, and damp concrete. It was the smell of momentum. It was the smell of survival. I slowly walked down the grated metal stairs, my boots clanking heavily against the iron steps. Down on the main floor, the symphony of heavy industry drowned out the quiet, lingering echoes of the past. Forklifts darted between towering racks of freight, their yellow warning lights flashing as their tires squealed against the polished cement. Men and women in thick canvas jackets and neon safety vests moved with practiced rhythmic efficiency. They were loading pallets packed with thousands of pounds of automotive parts, medical supplies, and raw machinery into the waiting trailers of my transport fleet. They shouted coordinates to one another over the roar of the idling engines, wiping sweat from their foreheads, despite the freezing air blowing in from the loading docks. I stepped off the stairs and merged into the flow of the warehouse. I did not wear a tailored suit today. I wore a faded denim jacket and a simple flannel shirt. I wanted to feel the grit of the environment that had built my life from the ground up. As I walked down the main central aisle, several of my employees offered a quick nod or a raised hand in greeting. I knew almost all of their names. I knew that Marcus, driving the heavy loader near Bay 4, had just welcomed a baby boy. I knew that Sarah, checking shipping manifests near the dispatch booth, was working double overtime to put her younger sister through nursing school. These were people who understood the precise value of a single dollar. They knew exactly what it meant to earn their keep through physical exhaustion and unwavering reliability. Watching them work the contrast between this loud, dirty warehouse and the pristine, silent luxury of a Parisian chateau felt sharper than ever. 3 months ago, I had almost surrendered a fortune to a family of desperate aristocrats who viewed this very labor as a profound humiliation. They had scoffed at the dirt on these concrete floors. They had wrinkled their noses at the exhaust fumes. They genuinely believed that wealth was a birthright, something meant to be inherited and hoarded rather than a tool forged through decades of relentless grinding effort. But standing here now, surrounded by the churning gears of actual productivity, their elitist arrogance felt incredibly small and completely insignificant. The silence from my daughter over the past 90 days had been absolute. Since the moment security escorted her out into the freezing parking lot, I had not received a single phone call, an angry text message, or a desperate email. Warren Cole received her pay stubs on the 1st and 15th of every month, confirming she had secured a job as a receptionist at a mid-range hotel downtown. He received the attendance logs from her financial literacy seminars verifying she sat in the back row twice a week, learning how to balance a standard checkbook and manage a living wage. She was doing exactly what she was legally obligated to do to receive her meager stipend. But she had not reached out to me. In the beginning, the silence had felt like a heavy stone sitting in the bottom of my stomach. There were nights when the house felt entirely too large and empty, without the chaotic financial drama that used to fill it. I would wake up in the dark, wondering if the lesson was too harsh, wondering if I had pushed her too far into the deep end of the ocean. But as the weeks turned into months, the crushing parental guilt slowly evaporated, replaced by a steady, enduring peace. That quiet emptiness in my home was 1,000 times better than the suffocating anxiety of waiting for her next catastrophic emergency. The toxic, parasitic relationship we had sustained for a decade was finally broken. For the first time in her adult life, Natalie was waking up every morning with a schedule she did not control, reporting to a manager who did not care about her last name, and earning a paycheck that required actual measurable effort. I was no longer her victim, and she was no longer my dependent. We were just two adults living entirely separate lives, dealing with the consequences of our own choices. I continued my slow, deliberate walk toward the enormous open bay doors at the far end of the facility. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the industrial skyline, painting the low-hanging clouds in bright shades of orange and bruised purple. A line of massive freight trucks idled in the yard, their engines rumbling like a chorus of mechanical beasts waiting to be released onto the highway. The drivers were leaning against their cabs, drinking steaming coffee from battered thermoses, their breath pluming into the cold morning air. The yard supervisor waved a heavy clipboard, signaling a driver to pull his rig forward into the loading zone. The sheer mechanical power of the operation was beautiful in its own brutal, honest way. This was the empire I had built with my own two hands. It was not glamorous. It was not designed to impress high society magazines or secure invitations to elite gala dinners in European castles. It was built on dependability, grit, and the unyielding promise that hard work actually matters. I stopped near the edge of the loading dock, letting the biting wind rush over my face. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the raw, unfiltered air of the city. I felt a profound sense of closure settling over my shoulders. The massive fortune I had accumulated over 40 years was no longer a weapon to be wielded against me. It was no longer a corrupting force poised to destroy the only child I had left. It was finally secure, completely protected, and ready to be utilized for something that truly mattered. I stood there watching the rising sun chase the long shadows out of the shipping yard, feeling completely ready for whatever the new day would bring. I was standing near the edge of Bay Number 4, watching a crew secure a heavy load of industrial machinery, when I saw Warren Cole walking across the warehouse floor. It was an unusual sight. My chief legal counsel rarely ventured out of the carpeted executive suites, and he certainly never walked directly through the active shipping lanes. He was wearing his usual immaculate dark charcoal suit and expensive leather shoes, navigating the concrete floor and avoiding the yellow safety lines with practiced precision. He carried a thick leather portfolio tucked securely under his right arm. Several of the dock workers paused to look at him as he passed by, but Warren kept his eyes locked entirely on me. He walked with a specific rhythmic purpose that told me the long administrative process we started 3 months ago was finally complete. I stepped away from the roaring forklift and met him near a quiet corner of the staging area. We stood beside a massive stack of wooden shipping crates as the smell of fresh pine and cold morning air swirled around us. Warren did not offer a formal greeting. He simply unclasped the brass locks of his leather portfolio, letting the sharp metallic sound cut clearly through the ambient noise of the warehouse. He reached inside and carefully pulled out a heavy stack of legal documents bound in thick, dark blue cardstock. He handed them to me, holding my gaze with a look of profound, absolute respect. I took the heavy stack of paper in my hands. I ran my thumb over the crisp edges, feeling the immense, satisfying weight, of what those pages represented. 3 months ago, I had stared at a single sheet of paper sitting on my mahogany desk. It was a wire authorization form for $700,000. That money was supposed to be sent across the Atlantic Ocean to rent a French palace for a single night. It was supposed to buy imported caviar, towering floral arrangements, and an illusion of aristocratic grandeur for a daughter who was deeply ashamed of the very warehouse we were currently standing in. I had shredded that authorization form and stopped the transfer. But the massive sum of liquid cash had remained sitting in a frozen corporate escrow account, acting as a silent ghost of a terrible mistake. Over the last 90 days, I had spent a lot of time thinking about that exact number. $700,000 is a staggering amount of money to spend on a superficial party. But it is an incredibly powerful amount of money if it is planted in the right soil. I realized that for my entire adult life I had been pouring water into a bottomless bucket, trying to satisfy a child who only wanted more. I decided it was time to redirect the flow. I wanted to take the exact fortune that was meant to fund an elitist fantasy and use it to build something profoundly real. Something Diane would have been incredibly proud of. I looked down at the title printed on the first page of the legal packet. It read, "The Diane Gallagher Vocational Scholarship Trust." I felt a sudden tightening in my chest, reading her name printed so formally. I had instructed Warren to draft the documents with brutal, specific precision. The money was completely and irrevocably removed from my personal estate and locked into a perpetual educational foundation. But it was not a traditional scholarship fund. It was not designed to send privileged teenagers to elite universities to study abstract theories and attend fancy networking galas. I told Warren I wanted the money to go exclusively to the children of my employees. The children of the men and women who drove the freight trucks, managed the dispatch lines, and sweated on the loading docks. I wanted the funds restricted specifically to vocational training and trade schools. I wanted to pay for welding certifications, commercial driving licenses, electrical apprenticeships, and advanced mechanical engineering programs. I wanted to buy the heavy steel tools, the textbooks, and the safety equipment for young men and women who were not afraid to get their hands dirty. I wanted to reward the exact same blue-collar grit and relentless work ethic that had built my logistics empire from a single rusted truck into a continental fleet. Warren watched me read through the final stipulations. He pointed to the bottom of the last page indicating the signature line. He told me the banking structures were fully established and the initial seed capital of $700,000 was ready to be transferred the moment I applied my signature. He told me the trust was designed to be self-sustaining, investing a portion of the capital to ensure it would continue funding trade school tuition for generations to come. He said it was the most elegant piece of philanthropic architecture he had ever drafted in his entire career. I reached into the inner pocket of my faded denim jacket. I bypassed the cheap plastic pens I usually kept there and pulled out the heavy silver pen I had carried down from my office. It was the exact same silver pen that Natalie had used to sign away her luxurious life in the boardroom 3 months earlier. The poetic justice of using that specific instrument was not lost on me. It felt incredibly appropriate. It felt like closing a deeply painful circle and starting a completely new one. I did not walk back up the metal stairs to the quiet comfort of my executive office to sign the paperwork. I placed the thick stack of blue-bound documents directly onto the rough surface of a wooden shipping crate. I leaned over the crate, ignoring the dust and the splinters pressing the heavy silver pen against the crisp parchment paper. The warehouse roared around me, creating a beautiful, deafening symphony of reversing trucks, shouting foremen, and heavy machinery. I pressed the silver tip to the signature line. The dark ink flowed smoothly across the page, binding the money permanently to the foundation. I signed my name with bold, sweeping strokes, securing a legacy built on honest sweat instead of arrogant illusions. I lifted the pen and handed the documents back to Warren, knowing my debt to the past was finally paid in full. Warren tucked the signed documents securely into his leather briefcase and gave me one final nod. He turned and walked back toward the executive staircase, leaving me standing alone next to the wooden shipping crates. The roaring sounds of the warehouse wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I did not move right away. I stayed in the shadows of the staging area watching the men and women who kept my company alive. I watched them lift and carry and drive. I thought about the massive amount of money I had just permanently given away. It was a fortune that could have bought luxury cars and diamond necklaces, but instead, it was going to buy steel-toed boots and welding torches. My eyes found their way to bay number 7. Thomas was the senior foreman on the floor. He was a massive man with hands like shovels and a thick gray beard. He had worked for me for 25 years. He was the kind of man who never complained about the cold and never asked for an easy shift. I knew his story well. His wife passed away a decade ago, and he raised his 3 kids entirely on his own. His youngest daughter was 19, and she wanted to be an aviation mechanic. Thomas worked 60 hours a week trying to save enough money to pay for her specialized certification program. He picked up every extra shift I offered. I used to watch him eat cold soup from a plastic container sitting on a stack of pallets, just so he could save an extra $5 a day for her tuition. I knew the Human Resources Department was distributing the first round of the new scholarship letters this morning. I had specifically instructed them to deliver the envelopes directly to the warehouse floor. I wanted the parents to open them right where they earned them. I stood quietly behind the crates and watched as Linda from Human Resources walked out onto the loading dock. She was holding a stack of thick white envelopes. The warehouse noise dipped slightly as the workers noticed her. Linda walked straight over to Bay 7. Thomas had just finished securing a heavy load of industrial pipes. He pulled off his thick canvas gloves and wiped the grease from his forehead. Linda smiled at him and handed him one of the white envelopes. Thomas looked confused. He wiped his hands on his denim jeans before taking the envelope. He probably thought it was a new corporate policy or a standard tax form. He tore open the top edge with his thick fingers. He pulled out the crisp letterhead of the Diane Gallagher Vocational Scholarship Trust. I watched him read the first line. Then I watched him stop. He lowered the paper and looked around the warehouse as if he had forgotten where he was. He took a deep, shaky breath and raised the paper to read it again. He read the part that stated his daughter had been selected for a full-ride scholarship. He read the paragraph that promised every single penny of her aviation mechanic program was completely paid for in full. He read the sentence that guaranteed she would graduate without a single dollar of debt. The tough senior foreman who routinely carried 200-pound engine blocks by himself suddenly dropped to his knees. He collapsed right there on the dirty concrete floor of the loading dock. He buried his face in his large, rough hands, and his massive shoulders began to shake violently. He was weeping. He was crying with the absolute raw intensity of a father who just realized his child was safe. The crushing, heavy burden he had carried for a decade had simply vanished. He did not have to work double shifts until his back gave out anymore. His little girl was going to build airplanes, and she was going to do it because her father was a reliable, honest man who showed up to work every single day. Several of the other dock workers stopped their machines and walked over to him. They patted his back and asked him what was wrong. Thomas could not even speak. He just handed the letter to the man standing next to him. The other worker read it out loud, and then he pulled Thomas into a massive bear hug. The cheer that erupted from Bay 7 echoed all the way up to the steel rafters. I felt a thick, heavy lump form in my throat. My vision blurred slightly as I watched them celebrate. I thought about my late wife, Diane. I knew she was looking down at this exact moment. I knew this was the only legacy she ever wanted me to leave behind. I had spent so many years trying to buy the affection of a daughter who was ashamed of me. I had wasted so much energy trying to build a fortress of wealth around someone who only used it to look down on others. But watching Thomas cry tears of pure joy on the dirty concrete floor, I knew I had finally done the right thing. This was the true power of money. It was not meant to buy aristocratic titles or rent French palaces for people who despised you. It was meant to lift up the people who actually pulled the wagon. It was meant to reward the grit and the grind and the honest sweat that keeps the world turning. I slowly walked away from the staging area. I bypassed the stairs leading up to my comfortable, quiet executive office. I did not want to sit in a leather chair today. I walked straight down the main aisle toward the open bay doors at the end of the warehouse. The massive metal doors were rolled all the way up, exposing the yard. I stepped out onto the very edge of the loading dock. There were no walls out here. There was no soundproof glass to keep the world away. The freezing Chicago wind hit my face immediately. It bit through my flannel shirt and chilled my skin. It was brutal and sharp and incredibly real. I closed my eyes and took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the smell of diesel fuel and melting snow. I listened to the roaring engines of the freight trucks idling in the yard, waiting to carry their loads across the country. I felt the deep rumbling vibration of the concrete beneath my work boots. For the first time in a decade, the heavy, suffocating weight on my chest was completely gone. I was no longer an embarrassing secret hidden away in a Midwestern industrial park. I was exactly where I belonged. I was a man who built an empire with his own two hands, and I was finally using it to protect the only thing that actually mattered. Hard work, honest labor, real respect. I opened my eyes and looked out at the city skyline breaking through the gray winter clouds, completely ready to get back to work. The story of James and Natalie teaches us a profound lesson about the true nature of support. We often believe that providing everything for our loved ones, shielding them from every hardship, struggle, and financial worry, is the ultimate expression of care. However, unconditional financial backing without boundaries or expectations can inadvertently breed severe entitlement and arrogance. Real love sometimes requires making the agonizing choice to cut the safety net. It means allowing people to face the natural consequences of their actions and learn the value of honest hard work. True wealth isn't found in bank accounts or societal status, but in character, gratitude, and earned respect. If James's journey resonated with you, hit the like button, subscribe for more stories, and let us know in the comments below about a time you had to set a difficult but necessary boundary with someone you love.